establishing some norms in cyberspace is important. And one area where we have made some progress on this is with regard to our relationship with China, where the United States has reached an agreement with China to establish a norm that state-sponsored, cyber-enabled theft for commercial purposes is not something that's appropriate in cyberspace. And you heard the intelligence officials today indicate that they have seen a reduction in the kind of malicious cyber activity emanating from China targeting U.S. businesses. That's a positive impact. Does that entirely solve the problem? Of course not. But it does give us a sense of the kinds of solutions that we need to consult to enhance our security in cyberspace. And this is not something that's going to get solved overnight, and this is not likely to be solved in the term of the next president, but something that policymakers will be grappling with for quite some time.
Maybe you could say, how is it not an active war then to attack democracy in this way?
Well, it is something that is deeply serious and something that the administration takes quite seriously, and I think that's evident not just from the public comments you've seen from the intelligence community, but that's also evidence from the response that's been put forward.
Thanks, Josh.
Okay, Bob.
Hey, Josh, back on the Affordable Care Act for a moment. How involved does the president plan to stay in what I'll go so far as to say will be the replacement process, which is probably going to come piecemeal? He was up on the Hill yesterday asking Democrats to hold fast against any major changes to this overall program we call Obamacare. How much does Barack Obama expect the Democrats to seek his counsel and or give his blessing to this change is good, that change isn't good, something along those lines? How involved can he stay in all of this?
Listen, as we discussed earlier, the advice that President Obama had for Democrats is that they should fight against the Republican effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act because of the extraordinarily negative impact it would have on millions of Americans, including the 30 million Americans who would lose health insurance, and including the 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions who would lose the protection against that prevents insurance companies from discriminating against them. That only happened because of the Affordable Care Act, and stripping that protection away would have a negative impact on a large number of Americans. The argument that the president has made is that isn't just bad for the American people and bad for our economy and bad for the deficit. It's also bad politics. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, and the president certainly doesn't think it's a foregone conclusion that Republicans will succeed in repealing the law. They were only able to marshal 51 votes yesterday in the Senate to merely instruct committees to see if they could come up with a way to repeal the law. So they've got a very narrow margin for error, particularly when you consider how united Democrats are. So that's the advice that President Obama had for Democrats. With regard to the role that he can play in his post-presidency, I would not expect for him to play a large public role in this fight. If there are people who want to seek his counsel, either for policy solutions or for particularly persuasive arguments that can be made publicly, I wouldn't be surprised if he engages in those kinds of private conversations, not regularly, but I wouldn't be surprised if something like that occurred. But as I mentioned yesterday, the president's expectation is that congressional Democrats and Democrats across the country are going to have to stand up and speak out. And if they do, that will serve the country well. It will prevent Republicans from succeeding in repealing the Affordable Care Act. And it will give you provide an excellent opportunity for a new generation of Americans, a new generation of Democrats to step forward and begin to make their voice heard and exercise some influence in our political debate, and again, in a way that'd be good for the country and good for the Democratic Party. Okay? Mark.
Yeah, a couple more in general terms about the review the president's being briefed on now.
Okay.
I realize he's still getting briefed, but does he have any initial reactions to what he's seen? Does he think this report contains something substantial and new that he hasn't already been briefed on? And does it contain any smoking guns that would convince skeptics?
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen the report, so I wouldn't characterize it at this point about whether or not it includes smoking guns or other things. I think the caution that I would point out is that while the intelligence community is committed to fulfilling the president's instructions to make public as much as possible, they're sharply limited in their ability to produce a lot of information given the need to protect sources and methods. So I haven't seen the report. I don't know what will be included in the report. But I do anticipate that it will be difficult to produce something like that. But we'll have to see what they come forward with, and ultimately, I think we'll. I'll be exercising some of our own judgment about what exactly the report means. So since the president's getting briefed on it right now, I haven't gotten a reaction from him. But presumably at some point the president will be asked about it, and he'll have an opportunity to offer that reaction.
All right. Admittedly, chunks of it are not going to be able to be made public, so the public might not be convinced. But obviously, one recipient of the full report is going to get briefed on it tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Is this report going to be convincing to that recipient?
There are a number of things that come to mind that I could say in response to that question, but I'll exercise some discretion today and say we'll see. I know. Kevin.
Thanks, Josh. I wanted to draw your attention to something that was circulating online yesterday. A beating that apparently took place on Facebook Live involving 4 individuals in Chicago. Is the White House aware of this video? Would the president himself have been aware of this, and would he have any comment about what happened?
Kevin, I've seen the video in news coverage, and I know that local officials, law enforcement officials, are investigating this matter. Based on news reports that I've seen, there some individuals who were likely involved are in custody. So they're still conducting an investigation about the disturbing images that we saw in that video. They do demonstrate a level of depravity that is an outrage to a lot of Americans. I haven't spoken to the president about it, but I'm confident that he would be angered by the images that are depicted on that video. But I believe it's important for us to defer to the important work that local law enforcement must do in investigating these kinds of incidents. So I don't want to say a whole lot more than that. But obviously this is something that's gotten a lot of attention, and for good reason.
Would this rise to the level of a hate crime, in your opinion?
I think it's too early to tell. I certainly don't want to predict where the investigation would lead. I think our expectation would be that local law enforcement would follow the facts, and I wouldn't speculate at this point about to what degree federal officials would get involved for considering those kinds of crimes. Obviously, a decision by the Department of Justice to investigate a matter like this is something that is a decision that they would have to make alone.
Piggyback on something Justin was talking about earlier, and that is this idea that the president gets briefed on this report, and yet sanctions and other decisions were doled out on the Russians prior to the completion of the report. And I'm wondering, does that mean there was sufficient evidence in the administration's opinion prior to the completion of the report that the president's receiving a briefing on now to make that action? And if that's the case, why not wait until the report itself was complete?
Kevin, there was a desire on the part of the U.S. government to be forceful in our response, but also to be very precise in our response. And that meant that there are a variety of agencies, including the Treasury Department and the Department of State and others, had to carefully evaluate how best to use the tools that were available to them to implement a response to this situation. And as soon as those response options had been considered and developed, that we worked to implement them quickly. There was no need to wait for additional evidence to substantiate the kind of response that was put forward. And again, I think based on the unprecedented nature of the statement that was issued by the intelligence community a month before the election. I think that should be a clear indication to everybody of the depth of conviction, the high confidence that the intelligence community had in the conclusions that they publicized back in October.
So that report, the one the president's being briefed on, it wasn't completed last week. It was, in fact, completed very recently, yesterday, for example.
I believe that the Director Clapper indicated in his testimony today that the report was only recently completed.
Let me ask you about the exit statements. It's an interesting approach. I don't think I've ever read exit statements like we've seen in previous administrations, sort of so publicly dispensed. What was the thinking behind that? Why is that important?
These are the exit memos from the cabinet agencies. Listen, over the course of the last year, the president has directed his team to be focused on ensuring a smooth and effective transition to the next administration. And that was a tasking that the president gave to officials in a wide variety of agencies before we knew the outcome of the election. But in that process, these agencies were compiling material to help the incoming team hit the ground running, to understand what kinds of issues they were likely to inherit, to understand what kinds of strategies we had implemented and what kind of results we had to show for the strategy that we implemented. And in developing this material, it became clear that these memos would provide the American people a lot of insight into the important work that's been done over the last 8 years, into the progress that we've made over the last 8 years, but also in the challenges that remain. The president made a decision, and again, I think this is consistent with his commitment to transparency. He said, let's make these memos public, and let's share with the American people in a comprehensive fashion. Let's show them our work. Let's show them what we've done, but let's also be honest about the challenges that remain. We've talked before about what the outcome of the election means for the country, and it means that somebody who has promised to try governing the country in a different way is going to get the opportunity to do that. And there will be an opportunity for all of you and for the American public to evaluate what kind of progress they're making. We've established benchmarks about the progress that the country made in the last 8 years under President Obama's leadership, and you'll be able to compare the progress that was made under President Obama with the results of the incoming administration's leadership, and I think that should inform people. It will inform people about the most effective way to lead the country in the future. And if the incoming administration is able to exceed these benchmarks in a whole variety of areas, that obviously would be a powerful endorsement of the approach that President Trump chooses to take. If not, it won't be.
Couple quick ones. First on Gitmo, is it your expectation that there will be a reduction in the number of detainees again this week? And can you sort of clarify the administration's perspective on the recidivism rate of those who have either gone back into battle and have either been reapprehended or not?
Yes. I am not able to speak to any specific detainee transfers between now and January 20th, other than to confirm for you that there are likely to be some. And whenever those transfers take place, once they have been completed, we announce them publicly. And that will continue to be our approach through January 20th. And my expectation is that there will be some additional announcements of that type. With regard to this question about...
This week, you think?
I'm sorry?
Including this week?
I can't speak to timing at this point. Okay. But certainly before January 20th. With regard to this question about re-engagement, you'll recall that President Obama, upon taking office in 2009, ordered a comprehensive review of the file of every single detainee at the prison at Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
And the purpose of that review was to determine whether or not individuals under an appropriate set of security requirements could be safely transferred to another country in a way that would not undermine U.S. national security. And the process that he established required a variety of agencies, including the Secretary of Defense, to certify that the appropriate security requirements were in place before an individual was transferred. This careful, specific approach was a departure from the approach that was taken by the previous administration, and it shows in the results. The percentage of those who have been confirmed of re-engaging in the fight by the intelligence community these are individuals who were released or transferred from Guantanamo before 2009, before President Obama took office, is 21%. 21% of the Gitmo detainees who were released before President Obama took office have been confirmed by our intelligence agency of re-engaging in the fight. Since President Obama took office and since these reforms were initiated, 9 detainees have been confirmed by the intelligence community of re-engaging in the fight. Considering that we have released 183 detainees during President Obama's time in office, a little back-of-the-envelope math would indicate that our percentage is much better, and it's a result of the reforms that President Obama instituted on his first day in office.
Does that include now deceased combatants?
We can check on the details for you on that.
Okay. Lastly, and Tuesday we were talking about the president and the economy and having created 900,000 manufacturing jobs. We're doing some number crunching, and it seems to be a little bit higher than that which we've come up with. Can you sort of help me square the difference? I think we came in around 807 or something.
Yeah, I think what I said was nearly 900,000. I did overshoot the mark a little bit. I was just working off of memory. I didn't have the numbers in front of me.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. Ron.
Just on this, to follow Kevin's question about this review and briefing the president's getting, I don't understand what's new or what's being learned or what was asked that moves the whole situation past what you knew, order sanctions and removal of diplomats, to where we are today. What questions are now answered, and what's new, or what's the president learning about that he didn't know then, but already felt confident enough that he should make these moves that he did?
Well, I think there are a couple of parts of this, Ron. The first fact is that this report is, despite all the attention that is understandably focused on the review of Russian involvement and Russia's malicious cyber activity in the context of the 2016 election, this review will take a look at malicious cyber activity in previous presidential elections as well, including by actors other than Russia. So it's a little bit broader than just this one incident. The second thing is, the last time that we heard formally from the intelligence community on this matter was the first week in October. And since that time, the intelligence community has dedicated significant resources to learning as much as they possibly could about the Russian malicious cyber activity and the efforts that they undertook to undermine or raise questions about the durability of the American democracy. That's the material that they were reviewing and including in the report. I can't say at this point exactly what that means for the content, because I haven't seen the content.
And you said that you described a process kind of underway of briefing there. Who exactly is briefing the president? How many cabinet secretaries are involved?
Yeah, it's members of his national security team, including some of the individuals who testified on Capitol Hill today. It essentially is senior officials who are responsible for compiling the report.
So we're talking about a half a dozen or more people, or?
I think it's more than that, but I don't have a specific manifest for the meeting to share.
And will this? Director Clapper talked about motive and intent a bit on the Hill, and said that there was more than one motive. Will this? Does this review answer the question of whether the Russians intended to and were motivated to try to make Donald Trump or help him become president?
Yeah, I can't speak to the contents of the report because I just haven't seen it.
But even without seeing it, going into this process, or as this process was ongoing, was that one of the questions that was going to be answered?
Well, again, I would leave it to the intelligence community to say what they're going to include in the report, and I think this will be easier to discuss then. But look, as I said last month at some length, you don't need a security clearance to know the impact that this Russian hack and leak strategy had on the campaign. Again, it was the DNC whose emails were hacked and released, not the RNC's. It was John Podesta's emails that were hacked and released, not Reince Priebus. It was the Trump campaign that had positive things to say about President Putin's leadership, and it was the Trump campaign that raised questions about their ongoing commitment to NATO. So,
then why won't you
again,
say the Russians tried to get Donald Trump elected?
Well, again, because we're going to wait on an intelligence community assessment, but again, I think that there's certainly some common sense that can be applied that doesn't require a security clearance.
And in talking about this, you always use the term high confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something higher than high confidence there, like highest confidence or most highest? I mean, is that
Ultimate confidence or something?
this could actually be like a fairly low standard high confidence. There's like ultimate and
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be.
It's okay. You should probably direct this question to an expert in the intelligence community. What I can assure you is it's not a low standard. It is, as the name suggests, an extraordinarily high standard. It is not
something higher.
Well, it is not uncommon for the president and other decision makers to get analysis from the intelligence community that is a low confidence or a moderate confidence assessment. That's not unusual. That is an effort by the intelligence community to provide as much information, as much analysis as possible. So the fact that this is that these are conclusions that have been reached with high confidence is an indication of their high confidence in this information.
Said it was not a close call. This wasn't tough to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Again, I think that is. I think the best way to interpret this is to consider the extraordinary nature of the statement that was issued by the intelligence community before the election. That is not something that's happened before. That's unprecedented, and the fact that they were not just able but willing to make such a forceful statement on the record in advance of the election, I think is telling.
All right. Lastly, completely different subject. What are the president and first lady doing tomorrow night, Friday night?
There have been some reports about the president and first lady hosting a social event here at the White House, and that's something that they've done in the past, and it's something I anticipate they're going to do again tomorrow.
Anything more about it? Are you going?
I don't have any details about who's attending, and I'll get back to you about my own personal plans for Friday night.
But
I
again,
don't know if that's an invitation or.
it's
I'm just teasing.
this is a farewell party, essentially.
Look, over the years, the president and first lady have, on occasion, not frequently, but on occasion, have hosted parties at the White House for their friends, and I anticipate this will be the last one that they have. They've got some packing to do.
Thanks,
All
Josh.
right, Jordan.
Thanks, Josh. I want to ask you about a resolution that's being voted on in the House this afternoon, the UN Security Council resolution on Israeli settlement activity. It condemns the resolution and calls for its repeal. Wondering if the White House has seen that resolution and what, if any, reaction you have to it.
Mm-hmm. I'm aware of the resolution. Obviously, it is not at all something that the Obama administration agrees with. The action that was taken by the Obama administration a couple of weeks ago at the United Nations Security Council reflected the president's consideration of America's foremost national security interests. It reflected a careful consideration of the policy that the United States has pursued under presidents in both parties, which is the need for a two-state solution to resolve the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians in the region. And the United States declined to veto a resolution that expressed concern about the accelerated pace of Israeli settlement construction, and notably, the continued violence and incitement that we've seen in the context of that conflict. Both of those things are making it harder for both sides to come together around a two-state solution. And in fact, both of those actions are actually putting a two-state solution even further out of reach. And the administration is deeply concerned about that. The United States has long articulated our commitment to a secure, democratic Jewish Israel, living side by side in peace and security with a contiguous, viable Palestinian state. And outside of that solution is only a single state that would force the Israeli government and the Israeli people to choose between being Jewish and democratic, because given the size of the large Palestinian population in that area. So this is something that the trend lines are not good. And that's why the Obama administration took, admittedly, a notable step, but a step that is entirely consistent with the long-held bipartisan policy of the United States of America.
And on another topic, there are a number of House Democrats who have decided to boycott the inauguration activities to protest President-elect Trump. Obviously, the president is going to participate in them, and he's talked about the need for a smooth transition.
Mm-hmm.
Does the White House have any view on whether it's appropriate for these members to, sit on the sidelines and protest the president-elect?
I'm not aware of any view that the president has expressed. I think the president's view is members of Congress can attend the inauguration if they'd like, and if they don't want to, I think that's probably fine too. Okay, Mark.
Josh, what is the president's thinking in submitting or resubmitting 10 nominations to the Senate yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
Several inspectors general, as I recall.
Yeah, I think the president's just fulfilling his presidential responsibility to continue ensuring that the federal government is fully staffed, and the individuals, the men and women that President Obama has put forward are individuals with the highest degree of integrity. These are accomplished professionals who are more than qualified for these positions. We've been disappointed that we haven't seen the Republican Congress act as expeditiously as they should have to confirm, and in some cases even consider, some of the president's nominees. I don't. We'll have to see, what the congressional response to these nominees is. But obviously, there's a short window for them to act.
Very short.
Indeed.
Do you have any? Does President Obama have any expectation that this GOP Senate will act on these nominations?
Well, we certainly have seen a lot of Republican senators talk about how important it is for highly qualified inspectors general to be in place. So we certainly, if that's what they actually believe, then these individuals should be given due consideration.
Are these the last of his nominations?
I can't rule out at this point additional nominations, but we'll obviously let you know.
I also wanted to ask whether there was any consideration given to sneaking in a recess appointment during the 5-minute intercession recess on Monday.
I'm not aware that there was.
And one last question.
At least not seriously. I guess I can't speak to what everybody might have been considering, but I'm not aware of any serious consideration to doing that.
Have you seen the article written by Mike McCurry and Ari Fleischer with recommendations to the Trump press operation? One of the things they're recommending is no more live TV coverage of White House briefings and rotating in reporters into the seats in the briefing room. Does that sound like something you could endorse?
Well, listen, I don't think I would endorse either of those things, but they're certainly provocative ideas, and they're not things that I would instinctively oppose either. I think what I've said publicly about this process is that it's a valuable one, and that there's a lot of symbolic value to a senior member of the president's team being held accountable, and for that accountability to play out on camera and on the record. I think that's a good thing for our democracy, and the president's actually found that to be a useful thing for his presidency. But look, this is an exercise that presidential press secretaries have engaged in for a couple generations now, and this venue and this process has evolved over time, and it's not automatically a bad thing if there are some innovations that can be introduced that would make this kind of exchange more fruitful and even more in line with the purpose of giving all of you an opportunity to demand some transparency and accountability. But it's hard to imagine that there's anything you could do to make the briefing more entertaining than it's been over the last couple of years. I say that facetiously. I'll do a couple more. Jared?
Josh, what's your message to voters who find the argument compelling, this argument pushed out by the president-elect and certainly many of his supporters, that intelligence community reports are not to be trusted because of alleged failures of intelligence community reports in the past?
Yeah. I think my message to voters is that the elections are quite a ways away. So the message, my message to citizens, though, that's what I was just going to say. My message to citizens is a couple of things. The first is there have been serious reforms that have been put in place since the high-profile intelligence failures around 9/11. And those reforms have addressed a range of bureaucratic inefficiencies that prevented some decision makers from getting timely, accurate information. And there should be motivation internally in the U.S. government, in the intelligence community, and in the White House to look for ways to continue to strengthen the kind of to strengthen the process by which the president and his team receive up-to-date, accurate information. What I can tell you is that over the last 8 years, President Obama has been extraordinarily well served by the timely and accurate advice that he's received from the intelligence community. So that's been a good thing, both in terms of the structure that's been in place, but also in terms of the people who've filled the boxes in that organizational chart.
Just one follow-up on Isaac's question about former Congressman Perriello. The president, you've described, and he's described a lot of enthusiasm for the prospects of the Affordable Care Act moving forward. Does that enthusiasm for the ACA, which obviously was a big part of the 2010 vote that took Congressman Perriello out of office, does that enthusiasm for Obamacare's future translate to enthusiasm for Perriello or for a Democrat's chances in 2017 in the gubernatorial race in Virginia?
Well, listen, I think I already have made the observation that if Republicans follow through on their promise to repeal the Affordable Care Act and take away health care for 30 million Americans and strip the kinds of protections that prevent 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions from being discriminated against, that doesn't sound like very good politics to me. But I think it's far too early to tell what sort of impact that could have on, for example, the Virginia governor's race. I do know that there is a unanimity of opinion among Democrats in Virginia about how important it is to expand Medicaid in Virginia. And the Republican obstruction that we have seen that has prevented thousands of people in the Commonwealth of Virginia from getting access to health care, I don't think that's going to be a political winner for them either. But I'm not, I'll let the individual Democratic candidates speak to their position on that.
One last one. This is about the DNC race. The mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg, has entered that race. Does the president know this mayor? Does he have a relationship with him? And this is something that developed during the briefing today, so I don't expect you don't have
I can tell you that the president has had an opportunity to meet him, and the president believes that he is obviously a young man with a very compelling story. He's already quite accomplished, but I'm not aware that the president, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not aware the president intends to formally endorse in the race, but we'll have to see what happens. Okay, Francesca, I'll give you the last one.
Coincidentally, I also have a question about the Democratic National Committee race.
Okay.
You just said that the president doesn't intend to formally or publicly endorse anyone, but has he privately endorsed anyone? And has he? No.
Well, it wouldn't be private if I said it here.
No. I'm just saying, has he privately endorsed anyone, and has he potentially encouraged anyone to join the race?
Yeah. Listen, I'm not going to. Obviously there are now at least a couple of people that are in the race. The president knows personally. The president obviously thinks very highly of a number of the people that have thrown their hat into the ring.